When Camilla Miller's doorbell rang at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, she expected to find a delivery driver or maybe Mrs. Henderson from next door asking to borrow sugar again. Instead, she opened the door to find Detective Sarah Chen holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that makes your stomach drop to your feet. Behind her stood a social worker with kind eyes and a briefcase that somehow looked heavier than it should have. "Miss Miller, we need to talk." "I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." Camilla's hands were still damp from washing breakfast dishes when she invited the detective and social worker, Janet Rodriguez, into her living room. The morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny warnings of chaos to come. Her twin sons, Marcus and Leo, were upstairs getting ready for school, their usual morning argument about who got the bathroom first echoing down the hallway. "There's been a complaint filed against you," Detective Chen began, settling into the armchair that Camilla's ex-husband, David, used to claim as his own. "Multiple neighbors have reported witnessing what they describe as physical abuse toward your children." The words hit Camilla like ice water. She sank onto the edge of the couch, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Marcus and Leo over the past weeks. Had she raised her voice when Marcus tracked mud through the house? Yes. Had she sent Leo to his room when he refused to do his homework 3 nights in a row? Absolutely. But abuse? "I'm sorry, what exactly are people saying I've done?" Janet Rodriguez opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "According to the reports we've received, neighbors have observed you grabbing your sons roughly, yelling at them in the backyard, and forcing them to stay outside in cold weather as punishment. One witness claims to have seen bruising on one of the boys' arms." Camilla felt the room tilt slightly. That's completely false. I would never hurt my children." "The complaints were filed by Rebecca Thornton," Detective Chen continued, reading from her notes. "She lives at 847 Maple Street, directly across from you. She's provided a detailed timeline of incidents dating back 6 months." Rebecca Thornton. Camilla should have seen this coming. David's new wife had moved into the neighborhood just 8 months ago, buying the house across the street with money from her previous divorce settlement. At first, Camilla had tried to be diplomatic. After all, Rebecca would be around Marcus and Leo during their weekend visits with their father. But Rebecca had made it clear from day one that she considered Camilla an obstacle to her new perfect family life. It started with small things. Rebecca would wave enthusiastically at the boys when they played in the front yard, then pointedly ignore Camilla. She began hosting loud barbecues on the same weekends David had the boys, making sure they could see all the fun they were missing from their mother's house. When Camilla had politely asked her to turn down the music one evening, Rebecca smiled sweetly and said, "I'm sure the boys would rather be over here anyway. David says they're not very happy at home." "Miss Miller?" Janet's voice pulled her back to the present. "Can you walk us through your typical discipline routine with your sons?" Camilla took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "Marcus and Leo are 11 years old. They're good kids, but they're still kids. When they misbehave, I use timeouts, take away privileges like video games or TV time, and yes, sometimes I raise my voice when I need to get their attention. But I have never, ever laid a hand on them in anger." "What about the incident last Thursday evening?" Detective Chen asked. "A neighbor reported seeing you forcefully drag one of your sons across the yard." Thursday evening. Camilla closed her eyes, remembering. Leo had been playing soccer in the backyard with his friend Jake from 2 houses down. When Jake's mother called him in for dinner, Leo had ignored her repeated calls to come inside for his own meal. She'd gone outside to get him, and he'd decided that was the perfect time to test his boundaries, running toward the street when she told him it was time to come in. "I grabbed Leo's arm to stop him from running into the street," Camilla said slowly. "There was a car coming, and he was about to dart between 2 parked cars. I pulled him back toward the house, and yes, I was upset because he could have been hurt." "And the bruising?" Leo fell off his bike 3 days before that. He's got a bruise on his upper arm from where he hit the handlebars. I took pictures of his injuries when it happened because I was worried about a possible fracture. Camilla stood up, her voice gaining strength. I can show you the photos, and you can ask Dr. Martinez at Riverside Pediatrics. I took Leo in to be examined the next day. Janet made notes in her file. We'll need to verify that information. In the meantime, we need to interview your sons. Of course, they're upstairs getting ready for school. Camilla paused at the bottom of the staircase. But I want to understand something. These complaints, they all came from Rebecca Thornton? Miss Thornton contacted our office initially, Detective Chen confirmed. She expressed concern about what she was witnessing and provided contact information for other neighbors who had supposedly seen similar incidents. Did you speak to these other neighbors directly? There was a pause. Miss Thornton served as a liaison. She indicated that the other witnesses preferred to remain anonymous due to their ongoing relationship with you as a neighbor. Camilla felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. So you have one person making accusations, claiming other people agree with her, but you haven't actually spoken to anyone else? We take all reports of child welfare seriously, Janet said diplomatically. That's why we're here to investigate thoroughly. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, his dark hair still messy from sleep. Mom, is everything okay? Leo's asking if we still have to go to school today. Looking up at her son's concerned face, Camilla felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. Marcus had David's stubborn chin, but her own questioning eyes, always trying to figure out the world around him. He'd been the one to ask, just last week, why Rebecca always stared at their house when she was in her front yard. He'd noticed the way she positioned herself to have a clear view of their backyard during the boys' outdoor playtime. Everything's fine, sweetheart. These ladies just need to ask you and Leo a few questions. Come on down. As Marcus descended the stairs, with Leo close behind, Camilla caught Detective Chen observing the interaction carefully. She watched the way the boys naturally gravitated toward their mother, how they stood close to her without any sign of fear or tension. Leo, shorter than his twin by 3 inches, and always the more affectionate of the two, automatically leaned against Camilla's side. Are we in trouble? Leo asked, looking between the two official-looking women with wide eyes. Not at all, Janet said gently. We just want to make sure you boys are happy and safe. Can you tell me how your mom treats you when you get in trouble for something? Marcus exchanged a look with Leo. She makes us sit on the timeout chair in the kitchen, and sometimes she takes away our PlayStation time. Does she ever hit you or hurt you physically? No, both boys said simultaneously, with the kind of automatic certainty that only comes from truth. What about last Thursday when you were playing outside, Leo? Detective Chen asked. Can you tell me what happened? Leo's brow furrowed in concentration. I was playing soccer with Jake, and Mom called me for dinner, but I didn't want to stop playing yet. So I tried to run to Jake's house, but there was a car coming, and Mom grabbed me so I wouldn't get hit. She was scared because the car was going really fast. Did it hurt when she grabbed you? Not really. I mean, she grabbed me kind of hard, but that's because she didn't want me to get hit by the car. Leo looked up at his mother. I said sorry afterward because I know I shouldn't run toward the street. Janet made more notes while Detective Chen asked a few more questions about their daily routine, their relationship with their father, and how they felt about living with their mother. The boys answered everything with the straightforward honesty of children who had nothing to hide. After 20 more minutes of questions, the officials prepared to leave, but not before informing Camilla that there would be follow-up visits and that she should expect a call from the family court system. We'll be in touch within the next few days, Detective Chen said as she handed Camilla her business card. In the meantime, I'd recommend documenting your interactions with your children and avoiding any situations that could be misinterpreted. As the door closed behind them, Camilla sank back onto the couch, her hands shaking slightly. Marcus and Leo flanked her, their earlier confusion replaced by concern for their mother. Mom, why did that lady think you hurt us? Marcus asked. Camilla wrapped her arms around both boys, pulling them close.
Sometimes people see things that aren't really there, or they misunderstand what they're seeing. But I need you both to know that no matter what anyone says, I love you more than anything in the world, and I would never do anything to hurt you. We know that, Leo said matter-of-factly. You're the best mom ever. As her sons headed upstairs to finish getting ready for school, Camilla remained on the couch, staring out the front window at Rebecca Thornton's house across the street. The white colonial, with its perfectly manicured lawn and cheerful yellow shutters, looked deceptively innocent in the morning light. But Camilla could see Rebecca's silhouette in the upstairs window, watching. This wasn't going to end with one visit from social services. Rebecca had fired the first shot in what was clearly going to be a much larger battle. What Rebecca didn't know, however, was exactly who she was dealing with. Camilla reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Hi, Mom," she said when the familiar voice answered. "I need your help." Justice Eleanor Miller had been preparing for oral arguments when her daughter's call came through. At 68, she maintained the same sharp focus that had carried her through 3 decades on the federal bench and the last 8 years on the Supreme Court. But when she heard the tremor in Camilla's voice, everything else became secondary. "Rebecca Thornton," Eleanor repeated, pulling up a legal pad and making notes as Camilla explained the morning's events. "David's new wife, the one who moved in across from you specifically to cause problems. She's filed false reports with child services, Mom. They're going to keep investigating, and I'm terrified about what she might do next." Eleanor had met Rebecca exactly once, at Marcus and Leo's soccer game 3 months ago. The woman had positioned herself strategically near the bleachers where Eleanor was sitting, making pointed comments about how difficult it must be for David to co-parent with someone so controlling. Eleanor had maintained her judicial composure, but she'd filed away every detail of that interaction. "Tell me about the detective and social worker who came to your house," Eleanor said, switching into the analytical mode that had served her well in courtrooms across the country. As Camilla recounted the interview, Eleanor's legal mind began identifying the weaknesses in the case against her daughter. Anonymous witnesses who hadn't been directly interviewed. Accusations based on misinterpretation of normal parenting situations. A complainant with clear bias and motive to fabricate stories. "I want you to document everything from now on," Eleanor instructed. "Every interaction with the boys, every conversation with neighbors, every time Rebecca does anything suspicious. Get a security camera system installed on your property today, and call Dr. Martinez's office to get copies of Leo's medical records from his bike accident." "Do you think they'll try to take the boys away from me?" The fear in her daughter's voice made Eleanor's chest tighten. She'd presided over family court cases early in her career, before her appointment to the federal bench. She'd seen how quickly false accusations could spiral out of control, especially when the system was overwhelmed and social workers were forced to err on the side of caution. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm driving down this weekend. We're going to handle this properly." After ending the call, Eleanor sat in her chambers overlooking the National Mall, watching tourists stream between the monuments below. She'd built her career on fairness, impartiality, and respect for due process. But this wasn't about jurisprudence anymore. This was about protecting her family from someone who had clearly declared war. Meanwhile, across town in Arlington, Rebecca Thornton was having lunch with her sister Maya at their usual spot downtown. Rebecca stirred her salad absently, her mind still focused on the morning's activities. "So the social worker and detective actually went to her house?" Maya asked, raising an eyebrow. "This morning. I saw them from my bedroom window. They were there for over an hour." Rebecca took a sip of her iced tea, satisfaction evident in her voice. "I told you that woman was unfit to raise those boys." Maya had heard variations of this conversation for months now. Her sister's obsession with David's ex-wife had grown increasingly intense since the wedding. At first, Maya had been sympathetic. Blended families were complicated, and it made sense that Rebecca would want what was best for her new stepsons.
But lately, Rebecca's complaints had taken on a vindictive edge that Maya uncomfortable. Are you sure you saw what you think you saw, Becca? I mean, kids can be pretty dramatic when they're playing outside. Rebecca's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Are you questioning my judgment? I know abuse when I see it, Maya. Those boys deserve better than what they're getting.
I'm just saying that maybe there's another way to handle this. Have you talked to David about your concerns? The truth was, Rebecca had tried to bring up her observations with David several times, but David had consistently defended Camilla's parenting, insisting that she was a devoted mother who would never harm their children. He'd grown increasingly frustrated with Rebecca's complaints, especially after she'd suggested that he petition for full custody. David's too close to the situation to see it clearly, Rebecca said dismissively. He still has feelings for her, obviously, but I'm looking out for Marcus and Leo's best interests. That evening, Rebecca positioned herself in her front yard, as she did every day around the time the boys came home from school. She was watering her flower beds when the school bus pulled up to the corner. Marcus and Leo bounded down the street, their backpacks bouncing behind them as they raced each other to their front door. From her vantage point, Rebecca watched Camilla greet her sons with hugs and ask about their day. The boys chattered excitedly about something that had happened during lunch, their animated gestures and laughter carrying across the street. To an objective observer, it would have looked like a normal, loving family interaction. But Rebecca had spent months interpreting every gesture, every raised voice, every moment of normal parental guidance as evidence of abuse. In her mind, Camilla's firm tone when she asked the boys to put away their backpacks became harsh discipline. The way she guided Leo toward the house with a hand on his shoulder became rough handling. What Rebecca didn't notice was the small security camera that had been installed above Camilla's garage door that afternoon, or the way her own surveillance had been observed and documented by Camilla's neighbor from 2 houses down. Dr. Patricia Walsh lived in the blue house at the end of the cul-de-sac and had been watching Rebecca's behavior with growing concern for weeks. As a retired child psychologist, Patricia recognized obsessive behavior when she saw it. She'd finally decided to act after witnessing Rebecca's daily monitoring routine and the way she seemed to manufacture drama from ordinary family moments. That evening, Patricia called Camilla directly. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," Patricia said when Camilla answered. "I'm Dr. Walsh from down the street. I wanted you to know that I've been watching what's been happening, and I'd like to help if I can." Patricia explained her background and her observations of Rebecca's behavior. More importantly, she offered to serve as a character witness and to provide professional testimony about Camilla's parenting if needed. "I've been working with children and families for 40 years, Patricia said. What I see when I watch you with your boys is a mother who sets appropriate boundaries, shows consistent affection, and handles typical childhood behavior with patience and humor. That woman across the street, however, is displaying some concerning patterns of behavior." The next morning, Camilla received a call from Janet Rodriguez, the social worker who had visited her house. Janet's tone was professional, but notably less suspicious than it had been during their first meeting. "Miss Miller, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. We've reviewed the medical records from Dr. Martinez's office regarding Leo's bike accident, and the documentation clearly supports your explanation about the bruising. Additionally, we've received some character references from other neighbors in your area." Camilla felt a wave of relief wash over her. Other neighbors? "Dr. Walsh contacted our office this morning. She provided detailed observations about your family interactions and requested to be interviewed as part of our investigation. We've also been contacted by the Johnsons from next door and the Patel family from across the street." The Johnsons were an elderly couple who had lived next to Camilla for 6 years. Mr. Johnson often helped the boys with their bike repairs, and Mrs. Johnson had been known to sneak them homemade cookies when they were playing in the backyard. The Patels had moved in 2 years ago, and their daughter Priya was in the same class as Marcus and Leo. What did they say? I can't share specifics, but I will say that their observations paint a very different picture than what was initially reported. We're still conducting our investigation, but the evidence is pointing toward a misunderstanding rather than actual abuse.
After hanging up the phone, Camilla felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. But she also understood that Rebecca wouldn't give up easily. If anything, the failure of her first attempt might make her more desperate and more dangerous. That afternoon, as Camilla was picking up groceries, she spotted Rebecca in the cereal aisle. For a moment, they stood facing each other across the shopping carts, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Rebecca's expression was cold, calculating. "I hear you've been rallying the neighbors," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over, Camilla. Those boys deserve a stable home environment." "They have one," Camilla replied evenly. "With me." "We'll see about that." As Rebecca pushed her cart away, Camilla realized that her mother had been right to come down this weekend. This battle was far from finished, and she was going to need all the help she could get. Eleanor Miller arrived at her daughter's house Friday evening in an unmarked rental car, carrying a briefcase that contained 40 years of legal experience and a grandmother's fierce determination. She parked 3 houses down and walked casually to Camilla's front door, observing every detail of the neighborhood layout as she moved. Marcus and Leo rushed to greet their grandmother with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for favorite relatives who understood the importance of good presents and loose rules about bedtime snacks. Eleanor hugged them tightly, but her eyes were already scanning the street, taking in sightlines, noting which windows had clear views of Camilla's property, and mentally cataloging potential witnesses. "Show me everything," Eleanor said once the boys were settled in the living room with a movie. Camilla walked her mother through the house, pointing out the new security cameras, the documentation she'd been keeping, and the folder of character references that had been pouring in from neighbors and teachers. Eleanor examined each piece of evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades building and dismantling legal cases. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to conduct a little experiment," Eleanor announced. "I want to see exactly what Rebecca can and cannot observe from her house." Saturday dawned crisp and clear. Eleanor positioned herself at Camilla's kitchen window with a pair of binoculars, while Camilla and the boys went about their normal weekend routine in the backyard. From Rebecca's house across the street, the angle made it impossible to see most of their yard due to a large maple tree and the positioning of Camilla's garage. "She's watching right now," Eleanor murmured, spotting Rebecca's silhouette in her upstairs window. "But she can only see a narrow strip along your back fence." The experiment continued for 2 hours. Eleanor documented exactly what could and couldn't be seen from various points in Rebecca's house, photographed the sightlines, and measured distances. Her legal mind was already formulating the defense strategy they would need. Meanwhile, Rebecca was growing increasingly agitated. She'd noticed the unfamiliar car parked down the street and the way Camilla seemed to be deliberately staging activities in the backyard. When she saw an older woman with silver hair moving around the property with what looked like surveying equipment, Rebecca's paranoia spiked. "David, you need to get over here right now," Rebecca called her husband, pacing in her living room. "She's got some kind of investigator at her house. They're probably trying to build a case against me." David was at his law firm's weekend retreat in Williamsburg, 3 hours away. He'd been looking forward to a peaceful weekend of golf and networking, away from the escalating drama between his current wife and his ex-wife. "Rebecca, what are you talking about? What investigator?" "There's been someone documenting everything all morning, taking pictures, measuring things. She's obviously trying to discredit my testimony." David rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar headache building. Maybe she's just having some work done on the house, or maybe it's an insurance adjuster. You don't know that it has anything to do with the child services investigation. "I know what I'm seeing, David. You need to come home and deal with this." But David had reached his breaking point with Rebecca's obsession. Over the past month, she'd called him at work 6 times to report incidents she'd witnessed. She'd started keeping a written log of Camilla's daily activities. She'd even suggested they install security cameras facing Camilla's house for the boys' protection. I'm not coming home early because you're spying on my ex-wife again, David said firmly. We've talked about this, Rebecca. You need to stop this behavior. It's not healthy for you, and it's not good for our marriage. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice had taken on a cold edge that David had never heard before. I see where your loyalties lie, but those boys are going to thank me someday when they're old enough to understand what I saved them from. After David hung up, Rebecca stood at her window for another hour, watching Eleanor move systematically around the property. When she saw Eleanor take photographs of her own house from various angles, documenting what could be observed from Rebecca's windows, she realized that somehow the game had changed. That afternoon, Eleanor suggested they visit Dr. Walsh, the retired child psychologist who had contacted Camilla. Dr. Walsh lived in a comfortable ranch house with a garden that looked like something from a magazine. She welcomed them with iced tea and homemade cookies, but her professional demeanor emerged quickly once they began discussing the situation. I've been observing family dynamics in this neighborhood for 15 years, Dr. Walsh explained, settling into her favorite armchair. What I've witnessed between Rebecca and your family shows classic signs of projection and manufactured concern. Eleanor leaned forward, her legal instincts engaged. Can you elaborate on that? Rebecca displays obsessive monitoring behavior, selective interpretation of normal interactions, and what appears to be an inability to distinguish between her own emotional needs and genuine child welfare concerns. She's created a narrative where she's the rescuer and Camilla is the threat, but there's no objective evidence to support that narrative. Dr. Walsh pulled out a thick folder from her coffee table. I've been documenting her surveillance patterns. She positions herself to watch your house every day between 3:15 and 4 p.m. when the boys come home from school. She waters her front garden every evening at 6 p.m., but only on days when the boys are at your house, never on weekends when they're with their father. You've been watching her watch us? Camilla asked. I became concerned about her behavior weeks ago. What initially appeared to be neighborly interest escalated into something much more troubling. I've seen this pattern before in my practice. Individuals who become fixated on a family situation and gradually lose the ability to assess it objectively. Eleanor made notes as Dr. Walsh continued her analysis. The psychologist's observations would be invaluable if this case ended up in family court, but Eleanor was already formulating a more direct approach. Dr. Walsh, would you be willing to provide expert testimony about Rebecca's behavior patterns and your professional assessment of Camilla's parenting? Absolutely. I've already prepared a preliminary report for the Child Services investigation, but I'd be happy to expand on that for any legal proceedings. That evening, Eleanor sat at Camilla's kitchen table with legal pads spread around her, building the case that would protect her grandsons and her daughter. She'd handled constitutional law for decades, but the fundamental principles remained the same: evidence, credible witnesses, and exposing the flaws in the opposing argument. Mom, what if she escalates further? Camilla asked, joining her mother at the table after putting the boys to bed. I keep thinking about what she might do next. Eleanor looked up from her notes, her expression serious but confident. Then she'll discover that she's picked a fight with the wrong family. I've spent my career dealing with people who think they can manipulate the system to get what they want. Rebecca Thornton is about to learn that actions have consequences. Sunday morning brought an unexpected development. Camilla received a call from Janet Rodriguez, who sounded unusually formal. Miss Miller, I need to inform you that we've received an additional complaint regarding your family situation. This one alleges that you're coaching your children to lie to investigators and that you're using intimidation tactics against the original complainant. Camilla felt her blood pressure spike. That's absolutely ridiculous. Who made this complaint? I can't share that information, but the allegations are serious enough that we need to schedule another interview with your sons, this time at our office rather than in your home. After ending the call, Camilla found her mother in the garden, where Eleanor was examining the new security camera footage from the previous day. She's filed another complaint, Camilla said, explaining the conversation with Janet. Eleanor didn't look up from the tablet displaying the security footage. Good. Let her keep digging her own grave. What do you mean? Eleanor turned the tablet toward her daughter, showing clear footage of Rebecca positioned behind her garden shed with what appeared to be binoculars, filming Camilla's backyard during yesterday's experiment. What I mean is that Rebecca has just committed stalking and harassment, and we have video evidence of it. She's also about to discover that filing false reports with government agencies is a federal crime. Eleanor's eyes held the same steely determination that had made her one of the most respected justices on the Supreme Court. It's time to remind Miss Thornton that the justice system works both ways. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made Camilla optimistic about new beginnings. Today, however, she was driving to the Department of Child Services office with her mother and a folder full of evidence that would either vindicate her completely or escalate this situation beyond anything she'd imagined. Eleanor had spent Sunday evening making phone calls to contacts throughout the Virginia legal system. As a Supreme Court justice, she had relationships with prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officials across multiple jurisdictions. More importantly, she had a reputation for being absolutely thorough when building a case. "Remember," Eleanor said as they pulled into the parking lot, "answer their questions directly and honestly. Don't volunteer additional information, and don't let them bait you into defending yourself against accusations that haven't been proven." The interview room at Child Services felt deliberately intimidating, with its fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture. Janet Rodriguez was there, along with her supervisor, a stern-looking woman named Patricia Hendricks, and Detective Chen. Marcus and Leo sat close together on one side of the table, their usual confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty about the formal setting. "Boys, we're going to ask you some of the same questions we asked before," Janet began gently, "but this time we need you to be extra careful to tell us exactly what happened, not what you think we want to hear." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Someone had suggested that Camilla had coached her sons to lie. "We always tell the truth," Marcus said, his voice carrying a hint of indignation that reminded Eleanor exactly at that age. "Mom taught us that lying makes everything worse." Over the next 40 minutes, the investigators questioned both boys extensively about their daily routines, discipline methods, and any conversations they might have had with their mother about the investigation. Marcus and Leo answered with the same consistent honesty they'd shown during the first interview, their stories unchanged and their affection for their mother evident. "Leo, last week you said your mom grabbed your arm to stop you from running into the street. Did anyone tell you to say that?" Leo looked puzzled. "No, that's just what happened. I was being dumb because I wanted to keep playing soccer, and I almost got hit by a car. Mom was scared, so she grabbed me harder than usual, but she wasn't trying to hurt me." "Has your mom ever told you what to say to police officers or social workers?" "She told us to always tell the truth," Marcus replied. "She said lying to officials is serious and can get people in really big trouble." Eleanor watched the investigator's body language throughout the interview. Janet Rodriguez seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning, while her supervisor maintained a skeptical expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind about the case. After the boys were dismissed to wait in the hallway, Patricia Hendricks addressed Camilla directly. "Miss Miller, we've received information suggesting that you've been intimidating the complainant in this case and attempting to manipulate the investigation through your connections." "What connections?" Camilla asked, genuinely confused. "We're aware that you've retained legal counsel and engaged private investigators to surveil the complainant." Eleanor had remained silent throughout the interview, but now she leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry, Miss Hendricks, but I need to stop you right there. I'm Justice Eleanor Miller of the United States Supreme Court, and I'm here as Camilla's mother, not as her legal counsel. We haven't retained any private investigators, and we certainly haven't engaged in intimidation tactics." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Patricia Hendricks' expression shifted from skeptical to alarmed as she realized the implications of what Eleanor had just revealed. "However," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the measured tone she used from the bench, "we have been documenting the ongoing harassment that my daughter and grandsons have been subjected to by Rebecca Thornton. And what we've discovered raises serious questions about the validity of the complaints filed against my daughter. Eleanor opened her briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. This contains photographic evidence of Miss Thornton conducting illegal surveillance of my daughter's property, including video footage of her trespassing and using recording equipment to monitor my grandson's activities. Janet Rodriguez leaned forward to examine the photographs Eleanor spread across the table. The images clearly showed Rebecca positioning herself with binoculars and what appeared to be a telephoto camera lens, documenting activities in Camilla's backyard. We also have sworn statements from 3 neighbors who have witnessed Miss Thornton's obsessive monitoring behavior over the past 6 months, Eleanor continued. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a retired child psychologist, has prepared a professional assessment of Miss Thornton's behavior patterns that raises significant concerns about her mental state and motivations. Patricia Hendricks studied the evidence with growing alarm. False reporting to child services was a serious offense, but if this had escalated to stalking and harassment, they were looking at potential criminal charges. Justice Miller, why wasn't this information provided during our initial investigation? Because initially, we believed this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved through proper channels. However, when Miss Thornton filed additional false complaints after we installed security cameras, it became clear that she has no intention of stopping this harassment campaign. Eleanor placed one final document on the table. This is a formal complaint that we're filing with the Arlington County Police Department, charging Rebecca Thornton with stalking, harassment, filing false police reports, and intimidation. We're also requesting that the FBI investigate this as a potential violation of my family's civil rights under federal law.
The room fell silent. Eleanor had just transformed a child welfare investigation into a potential federal case, and everyone in the room understood the implications. After the meeting, Camilla and Eleanor drove to a small cafe downtown where they could process what had just happened. Marcus and Leo were at school, blissfully unaware that their grandmother had just unleashed the full weight of the federal justice system on their behalf. "Do you think I went too far?" Eleanor asked, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "No," Camilla said firmly. "Rebecca was never going to stop. If anything, she would have gotten more desperate and more dangerous. You did what needed to be done." Across town, Rebecca Thornton was having a very different kind of meeting. Detective Mike Foster from the Arlington County Police Department had arrived at her house with a warrant to search for surveillance equipment and a list of charges that made her feel dizzy. "Mrs. Thornton, you're being charged with stalking under Virginia Code 18.2-60.3, harassment under Virginia Code 18.2-427, and filing false police reports under Virginia Code 18.2-461. You have the right to remain silent." As the detective read her rights, Rebecca's mind raced through the events of the past few months. How had her efforts to protect Marcus and Leo turned into criminal charges against her? She'd been trying to help those boys, trying to give them a better life with her and David. But even as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Rebecca couldn't shut the belief that she'd been right about Camilla. The fact that Camilla's mother was a Supreme Court justice only proved what Rebecca had suspected all along. This family had connections and power that they were willing to use to cover up the truth. David received the call about Rebecca's arrest while he was in a client meeting. He excused himself and drove home in a daze, trying to process how his marriage had imploded in the span of a single week. When he arrived at the house, he found police officers carrying boxes of evidence out the front door, including Rebecca's collection of photographs and the detailed journal she'd been keeping about Camilla's daily activities. Detective Foster handed David a copy of the search warrant and explained the charges against his wife. As David read through the evidence list, he realized that Rebecca's behavior had gone far beyond the concerned stepmother narrative she'd been selling him for months. "Mr. Miller, we need to ask if you were aware of your wife's surveillance activities regarding your ex-wife and children." David shook his head, genuinely shocked by the extent of what Rebecca had been documenting. "I knew she had concerns about Camilla's parenting, but I had no idea she was doing all this." That evening, as David sat alone in his house surrounded by the aftermath of Rebecca's arrest, he called Camilla for the first time in months.
Camilla, I need to apologize, he said when she answered. I had no idea how far Rebecca had taken this. If I'd known what she was really doing. David, the boys are fine, and this is almost over, Camilla replied. But Rebecca needs help. What she was doing wasn't a normal concern for the children. It was something much more serious. As David hung up the phone, he realized that his second marriage was probably over before it had really begun. But more importantly, he understood that he'd nearly lost his relationship with his sons because he'd failed to recognize how sick Rebecca had become. The next morning brought news that would seal Rebecca's fate permanently. Eleanor's contacts in the FBI had fast-tracked the federal investigation, and what they'd discovered went far beyond simple harassment. FBI Special Agent Sarah Kim arrived at the Arlington County Police Department on Wednesday morning with a team of digital forensic specialists and a warrant that would change everything. What had started as Eleanor Miller's request for a federal civil rights investigation had uncovered something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Rebecca's computer and phone records revealed a pattern of behavior that went back nearly 2 years, beginning long before she'd even met David Miller. The FBI's cybercrimes unit had discovered that Rebecca had been systematically researching and targeting divorced mothers in affluent neighborhoods, using social media and public records to identify potential victims. This wasn't random, Agent Kim explained to Detective Foster as they reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Thornton has a history of inserting herself into custody disputes. We've found similar patterns of behavior in 3 other states over the past 5 years. The digital evidence painted a chilling picture. Rebecca had created detailed profiles of at least 12 different families, complete with photographs of children, school schedules, work information, and relationship histories. She joined online forums dedicated to custody battles and child welfare, presenting herself as an advocate for children's rights while gathering intelligence on vulnerable families. Most disturbing of all, the FBI had discovered that Rebecca had been communicating with other individuals who shared her obsession with rescuing children from supposedly unfit mothers. The encrypted messaging app on her phone contained conversations with a network of people who traded information about families they were monitoring, sharing surveillance photos and strategies for filing complaints with social services. Meanwhile, Camilla was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Marcus and Leo. The boys knew that Rebecca had been arrested, but she'd tried to shield them from the full scope of what their stepmother had been doing. David had been coming by more frequently, helping with homework and staying for dinner, clearly trying to rebuild his relationship with his sons after months of prioritizing Rebecca's demands. "Mom, is Rebecca going to come back to our neighborhood?" Leo asked one evening as Camilla tucked him into bed. "No, sweetheart, Rebecca won't be bothering our family anymore," Camilla replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Good," Marcus said from the other bed. "She always made me feel weird, like she was watching us even when we couldn't see her." Camilla realized that her boys had been aware of Rebecca's surveillance all along, but hadn't known how to articulate their discomfort. Children's instincts about adults who meant them harm were often remarkably accurate, and she made a mental note to trust their judgments more in the future. Eleanor had returned to Washington, but remained in constant contact with the FBI investigation. Her position on the Supreme Court meant she had to be careful about appearing to influence a criminal case, but her initial complaint had set in motion a process that was now beyond her control. The prosecution is considering federal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the Interstate Stalking Statute, Eleanor told Camilla during one of their daily phone calls. If they can prove she was using electronic communications to coordinate harassment across state lines, she could be looking at serious federal prison time. The investigation expanded when FBI agents contacted Rebecca's ex-husband in Colorado, where she'd lived before moving to Virginia. Thomas Brennan told agents that Rebecca had exhibited similar obsessive behavior during their marriage, fixating on their neighbor's custody arrangement and filing numerous complaints with local authorities about alleged child abuse that was never substantiated. She became completely consumed with this idea that she could save children from bad parents, Thomas told Agent Kim during a video interview. She'd spend hours researching families online, taking photos of kids in public places, and documenting what she called evidence of neglect. I tried to get her help, but she insisted she was doing important work. Thomas's testimony revealed that Rebecca had been involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation in Colorado after she'd been caught trespassing on a neighbor's property while attempting to photograph their children. She'd been released after 72 hours and had seemingly stabilized, which was when she'd filed for divorce and left the state. Back in Virginia, David was facing his own reckoning with the reality of his marriage. Rebecca's bail had been set at $250,000, which he couldn't afford even if he'd wanted to pay it. Her sister Maya had stopped returning his calls after learning about the federal charges, and Rebecca's few friends had distanced themselves once the story hit the local news. "I keep asking myself how I missed all the signs," David confided to Camilla during one of his visits with the boys. They were sitting on her back deck while Marcus and Leo played soccer in the yard, the same yard that Rebecca had been photographing for months. "She was very good at hiding it," Camilla replied. "The FBI said this kind of behavior often escalates gradually. She probably started with small boundary violations and worked her way up to the surveillance." But the things they found on her computer, she had files on dozens of families, photos of other people's children. I feel sick thinking about what she might have been planning. The FBI's investigation had indeed uncovered evidence that Rebecca was planning to escalate her campaign against multiple families simultaneously. Her digital notes included detailed strategies for filing complaints with different agencies, timing coordination to overwhelm social services departments, and methods for recruiting witnesses to support false allegations. Most chilling of all was a document titled Project Safe Harbor that outlined Rebecca's vision for a network of activists who would systematically target single mothers and divorced families, using false allegations and legal harassment to force custody changes. She'd identified herself as the coordinator for the Virginia region and had been recruiting other participants through online forums. 2 weeks after Rebecca's arrest, Agent Kim requested a meeting with Camilla and Eleanor to discuss the broader implications of the case. They met at the FBI field office in Norfolk in a secure conference room that felt like something from a political thriller. "Mrs. Miller, what your family went through was part of a much larger criminal enterprise," Agent Kim began. "We've identified at least 8 other families across 4 states who were targeted by this network. Some of them lost custody of their children based on fabricated evidence." Eleanor leaned forward, her judicial instincts engaged. "Are you saying this was organized crime?" "We're treating it as a conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. Rebecca Thornton and her associates were using the legal system as a weapon to terrorize families, and they were coordinating their activities across state lines. That makes it federal racketeering." The scope of the investigation was staggering. FBI agents were reviewing hundreds of child services cases across multiple states, looking for patterns that might indicate coordinated false reporting. They'd already identified 12 cases where the same network of individuals had filed complaints against different families, using nearly identical language and accusations. "What happens to the families who lost their children?" Camilla asked, thinking about other mothers who might have gone through what she'd experienced, but without Eleanor's legal expertise to protect them. "We're working with family courts in multiple jurisdictions to review those cases. Some of the custody decisions are being reversed, and there will likely be civil lawsuits against the individuals responsible for the false allegations." As they left the FBI office, Eleanor was quiet, processing the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. What had started as a grandmother protecting her family had revealed a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed other families across the country. "Mom, what are you thinking about?" Camilla asked as they drove back toward her house. "I'm thinking about how many other families didn't have the resources we had to fight back," Eleanor replied. "How many children were separated from loving parents because of people like Rebecca?" That evening, as Camilla watched Marcus and Leo do their homework at the kitchen table, she felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with survivor's guilt. Her boys were safe, Rebecca was in federal custody, and their lives were returning to normal. But somewhere else, other families were still fighting battles they might not win.
The next morning brought news that would provide some measure of justice for those other families. The FBI had arrested 6 additional members of Rebecca's network in coordinated raids across 3 states, and federal prosecutors were announcing the largest civil rights conspiracy case involving family courts in decades. The federal courthouse in Alexandria buzzed with unusual energy as media crews set up outside for what prosecutors were calling the most significant family court conspiracy case in American legal history. Rebecca Thornton sat in the defendant's chair wearing an orange jumpsuit, her carefully maintained suburban facade replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose elaborate fantasy had crumbled into criminal reality. Eleanor Miller sat in the gallery, not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a grandmother who had helped expose a criminal network that had terrorized families across multiple states. Beside her, Camilla held a folder containing victim impact statements from 8 other mothers whose lives had been destroyed by Rebecca's conspiracy. Lead prosecutor Amanda Chen addressed the packed courtroom with the gravity the case deserved. Your Honor, the defendants before you today weaponized the family court system, turning child protection services into instruments of harassment and extortion. They systematically targeted vulnerable families, fabricated evidence, and coordinated false allegations that separated children from loving parents. The evidence presented over 3 days painted a picture of calculated malice that shocked even experienced legal observers. Rebecca's network had developed sophisticated methods for identifying targets, usually recently divorced mothers with stable incomes and custody arrangements that the conspirators could disrupt. Dr. Patricia Walsh testified as an expert witness about the psychological profiles of the conspiracy members. These individuals exhibited classic signs of savior complex disorder, combined with antisocial personality traits that allowed them to justify causing tremendous harm in pursuit of their perceived mission. The prosecution's star witness was Jennifer Martinez, a mother from North Carolina whose 3 children had been placed in foster care for 6 months based on false allegations filed by Rebecca's network. Jennifer's ex-husband had been recruited through online forums to participate in the harassment campaign in exchange for help gaining full custody. They made me feel like I was going crazy, Jennifer testified, her voice breaking as she described months of surveillance, false reports, and legal battles that had drained her savings. Every time I thought the nightmare was over, another complaint would be filed, another investigation would start. My children stopped trusting me because they'd been told their mother was dangerous. The financial scope of the conspiracy was staggering. FBI forensic accountants had traced over $400,000 in payments between network members, with Rebecca receiving consultation fees for targeting specific families and coordinating multi-state harassment campaigns. The network had developed a fee structure based on the complexity of each case and the desired outcome. Rebecca's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Michael Torres, struggled to present a coherent defense against the mountain of digital evidence. Rebecca had documented her activities so thoroughly that the prosecution essentially used her own words to convict her. My client suffers from mental health issues that impaired her judgment, Torres argued during closing statements. She genuinely believed she was protecting children, even though her methods were misguided and illegal. But Prosecutor Chen wasn't buying the mental health defense. The evidence shows that Mrs. Thornton and her co-conspirators operated with clear criminal intent. They developed sophisticated strategies, coordinated across state lines, exchanged money for services, and deliberately targeted families they knew were vulnerable. This wasn't delusion. This was calculated predatory behavior. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Agent Kim presented evidence of Rebecca's trophy collection, a digital folder containing photographs of children who had been removed from their homes based on the network's false allegations. Rebecca had saved these images like souvenirs, often adding captions about how she saved each child from their abusive parents. David Miller testified reluctantly for the prosecution, describing how Rebecca had manipulated him into unknowingly supporting her surveillance activities. His testimony revealed the extent to which she'd isolated him from friends and family while pursuing her obsession with destroying Camilla's life.
She convinced me that Camilla was unstable and that the boys were in danger, David said, unable to look at his ex-wife in the gallery. She'd show me photographs and videos that seemed concerning, out of context, but I know now that she was deliberately misrepresenting normal parenting situations. The defense called Rebecca's sister Maya as a character witness, but Maya's testimony backfired spectacularly when she admitted that she'd been concerned about Rebecca's behavior for years but had failed to intervene. Rebecca always had strong opinions about how other people raised their children, Maya testified. Even when we were kids, she'd criticize our neighbors and insist she could do everything better. I thought it was just her personality, but looking back, I can see the warning signs I ignored. On the trial's final day, Rebecca surprised everyone by requesting to address the court directly. Against her attorney's advice, she stood and delivered a rambling statement that revealed the depth of her delusion. I know the court sees me as a criminal, but I want you to understand that everything I did was to protect innocent children from parents who couldn't properly care for them, Rebecca said, her voice eerily calm. The system is broken, and sometimes good people have to work outside the system to achieve justice. Judge Harrison Matthews listened to Rebecca's statement with visible disgust. Mrs. Thornton, your actions weren't motivated by concern for children's welfare. You systematically targeted families, fabricated evidence, and caused immeasurable trauma to parents and children alike. You turned child protection into a weapon of personal vendetta. The sentencing phase revealed the full extent of Rebecca's network's impact. 17 families across 6 states had been targeted, resulting in temporary custody loss for 23 children. The psychological evaluations conducted on these children showed signs of trauma consistent with parental alienation and institutional abuse. Eleanor found herself thinking about the broader implications for the child welfare system as she listened to victim after victim describe their ordeals. The conspiracy had exploited legitimate concerns about child safety to perpetrate systematic abuse, potentially undermining public trust in protective services for years to come. Mrs. Thornton, you are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy to violate civil rights, racketeering, interstate stalking, and computer fraud, Judge Matthews announced. You will serve your sentence without possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The sentences for Rebecca's co-conspirators ranged from 3 to 9 years, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy. The FBI estimated that the network had been operational for at least 7 years before Camilla's case had exposed their activities. As the court session ended, Camilla found herself face-to-face with Jennifer Martinez, the North Carolina mother who had testified about losing her children. The two women embraced without words, sharing an understanding that transcended their different circumstances. Your mother saved not just your family, but all of our families, Jennifer said to Camilla. If you hadn't fought back, Rebecca would still be out there destroying lives. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor was approached by reporters seeking comment on the case's implications for family court reform. As a sitting Supreme Court justice, she had to be careful about her public statements, but she couldn't resist addressing the broader issues the case had revealed. This case demonstrates the importance of due process protections in family court proceedings, Eleanor said diplomatically. The system works when proper procedures are followed, but it can be manipulated by individuals with malicious intent. We must remain vigilant about protecting both children's safety and parents' rights. That evening, Camilla and Eleanor sat on the back deck where this nightmare had begun months earlier. Marcus and Leo were inside doing homework, their lives finally free from the shadow of surveillance and false accusations. The maple tree that had blocked Rebecca's view of their yard was beginning to change colors, its leaves a reminder that seasons change and healing is possible. "Do you think she'll ever understand what she did wrong?" Camilla asked, watching David's car pull into the driveway for his evening visit with the boys. Eleanor considered the question carefully. People like Rebecca rarely achieve genuine insight into their behavior. They're too invested in seeing themselves as heroes to acknowledge the harm they've caused. But at least now she can't hurt anyone else. The civil lawsuits that followed would take years to resolve, but the criminal convictions had already begun the process of reuniting wrongfully separated families and reforming the systems that had been exploited by Rebecca's network. 6 months after Rebecca Thornton's sentencing, Camilla Miller stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify about proposed reforms to the family court system. The hearing room was packed with advocates, legal professionals, and families who had been affected by various forms of judicial abuse. Eleanor sat in the front row, her presence lending weight to the proceedings, even though she couldn't participate directly due to her Supreme Court position. Senators, my name is Camilla Miller, and I'm here to tell you about how my family became the target of a criminal conspiracy that weaponized our child protection system, Camilla began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. What happened to us could happen to any family in America, and it's happening more often than most people realize. The committee had been formed in response to the Rebecca Thornton case and similar incidents across the country where false allegations had been used to manipulate custody proceedings. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, had been particularly moved by the stories of families who had been torn apart by coordinated harassment campaigns. Ms. Miller, can you walk us through the specific vulnerabilities in the system that allowed this conspiracy to operate for so long? Senator Williams asked. Camilla referred to the detailed report she'd helped prepare with legal advocacy groups over the past months. The primary problem is that Child Protective Services agencies are so overwhelmed and underfunded that they often can't conduct thorough investigations. When multiple complaints are filed against the same family, especially if they appear to come from different sources, there's a presumption that there must be some validity to the accusations. The reforms being proposed were comprehensive and had bipartisan support. They included mandatory cross-referencing of complaints to identify patterns of coordinated reporting, requirements for corroborating evidence before removing children from homes, and enhanced penalties for filing false reports with government agencies. Dr. Patricia Walsh testified as an expert witness, explaining the psychological profiles of individuals who engaged in this type of systematic harassment. Her research had expanded significantly since the Thornton case, as she'd been contacted by families across the country who suspected they'd been targeted by similar networks. We've identified at least 47 additional cases where the same tactics were used, Dr. Walsh told the committee. False reporting networks specifically target divorced mothers because they're statistically more likely to be financially vulnerable and less likely to have extensive legal resources to fight back. The hearing also featured testimony from Jennifer Martinez, whose children had been returned to her custody after spending 6 months in foster care based on Rebecca's fabricated allegations. Jennifer had become a powerful advocate for reform, using her experience to help other families navigate the complex process of challenging false accusations. My children still have nightmares about being taken away from me, Jennifer testified, her voice breaking slightly. They were told by social workers that their mother was dangerous, that they were being rescued from abuse that never happened. The psychological damage from that kind of institutional trauma can last a lifetime. The afternoon session focused on technological solutions that could help prevent future conspiracies. FBI agent Sarah Kim testified about the digital evidence that had exposed Rebecca's network and the patterns that might help identify similar groups in the future. These networks leave digital footprints, Agent Kim explained. They coordinate through encrypted messaging apps, share surveillance photographs, and maintain detailed records of their targets. We're developing algorithms that can identify suspicious patterns in social services reporting across multiple jurisdictions. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, life for Camilla's family had slowly returned to a new normal. Marcus and Leo, now 12 years old, had adjusted well to the changes in their family structure. David had moved to a smaller apartment closer to their school, and his relationship with his sons had actually improved since Rebecca's arrest. The forced separation during his marriage to Rebecca had made him realize how much he'd been missing from their daily lives. "Dad, are you going to get married again?" Leo asked one evening as David helped him with a science project about solar systems. David paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening his son with adult complications. "I don't know, buddy. Right now, I'm focused on being the best dad I can be to you and Marcus. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes in choosing who to marry, and I want to be really careful about that in the future. Marcus looked up from his homework. We like it better when it's just us anyway, and Mom's happier now too. David realized that his sons were more perceptive than he'd given them credit for. They'd been aware of the tension and stress that Rebecca had brought into all their lives, even before the surveillance and false accusations had escalated the situation into criminal territory. The house across the street from Camilla's had been sold to a young couple with twin toddlers. The new neighbors, Jake and Maria Santos, had introduced themselves with homemade cookies and genuine friendliness that felt refreshingly normal after months of suspicion and hypervigilance. It's nice to have neighbors who actually want to be neighborly, Camilla told Eleanor during one of their weekly phone calls. Maria asked if I wanted to join her book club, and Jake offered to help David fix the boys' basketball hoop. It feels like we can finally just be a regular family again. Eleanor had been following the legislative progress on family court reform with the intense interest of someone who understood how laws could either protect or endanger innocent people. The proposed legislation had gained momentum after high-profile hearings, but she knew that real change would take years to implement across all 50 states. The most important thing is that your testimony made other families realize they weren't alone, Eleanor told her daughter. We've already heard from 3 different states where similar networks have been exposed because families recognize the patterns you described. Indeed, the Rebecca Thornton case had triggered a wave of investigations across the country. Law enforcement agencies were reviewing thousands of child welfare cases, looking for signs of coordinated false reporting. Several other networks had been identified and dismantled, leading to additional federal prosecutions and the reunification of wrongfully separated families. The civil lawsuits stemming from the conspiracy were finally reaching resolution. Rebecca and her co-conspirators faced millions of dollars in damages for the trauma they'd inflicted on families. While most of them had limited assets, the legal precedent established by these cases would make it much easier for future victims to seek compensation. Jennifer Martinez had received a settlement that allowed her to relocate with her children and start fresh in a community where they weren't known as the family from the custody case. She'd used part of the money to establish a nonprofit organization that provided legal support to families facing false allegations. We want to make sure that other families have no resources to fight back that most of us didn't have initially, Jennifer explained to Camilla during a video call to plan their next advocacy event. Your mother's legal expertise saved your family, but most people don't have a Supreme Court justice to call for help. The nonprofit, called Safe Families Legal Defense, had already helped 12 families successfully challenge false accusations and regain custody of their children. They'd also worked with law enforcement to identify and prosecute 3 additional false reporting networks in different states. Back in federal prison, Rebecca Thornton spent her days in the library, researching appeals and writing lengthy letters to anyone who would listen about the injustice of her conviction. She maintained detailed correspondence with other inmates who shared her view that the system was corrupt and that she'd been framed by powerful interests. Her letters to Maya had stopped being answered months ago, after Maya had started therapy to process her own guilt about enabling Rebecca's behavior for so many years. Maya had testified in several of the civil cases, helping victims understand the warning signs that family members had missed or ignored. I keep thinking about all the times Rebecca made comments about other families, criticizing how they disciplined their children or managed their households, Maya told Dr. Walsh during one of their sessions. I thought it was just her being judgmental, but now I realize she was already identifying potential targets. David had also started therapy, working through the guilt and confusion of having been manipulated into supporting Rebecca's harassment campaign. His therapist had helped him understand that he'd been a victim as well, targeted specifically because his connection to Camilla made him valuable to Rebecca's plans. The boys had participated in family counseling sessions to help them process the trauma of having their family life disrupted by false accusations and criminal investigations. The therapist had been impressed by their resilience and their ability to maintain trust in their parents despite the chaos that had surrounded them. Kids are remarkably good at identifying authentic care versus manipulative behavior, the therapist explained to Camilla and David. Marcus and Leo never felt unsafe with you, Camilla, which is why Rebecca's accusations never made sense to them. Children's intuition about adult intentions is usually very accurate. As the first anniversary of Rebecca's arrest approached, Camilla found herself reflecting on how much had changed in her family's life. The security cameras were still installed around her property, but they felt less like defensive measures and more like practical precautions. The hypervigilance that had dominated her daily routine for months had gradually faded, replaced by a cautious optimism about the future. Eleanor visited for the anniversary weekend, bringing expensive steaks for a family barbecue and her famous apple pie that the boys had been requesting for weeks. As they sat around the dinner table, David included, as had become their new tradition for special occasions, the conversation flowed naturally between homework complaints, upcoming soccer tournaments, and plans for summer vacation. "Grandma, are you still the most important judge in America?" Leo asked as Eleanor topped him with seconds of pie. "I'm one of 9 very important judges," Eleanor replied diplomatically, "but I think being your grandmother is a more important job." Marcus, who had inherited his grandmother's analytical mind, wasn't satisfied with diplomatic answers. "But you used your judge powers to help Mom when Rebecca was being crazy, right?" Eleanor exchanged a look with Camilla, recognizing that her grandsons understood more about the situation than the adults had assumed. "I used my knowledge of the law to help your mom protect your family. That's what families do for each other. We use whatever skills and resources we have to keep each other safe." "So if someone tries to lie about our family again, you'll stop them?" Leo asked with the directness that only children possess. "I'll do everything in my power to protect you, but more importantly, what happened with Rebecca has helped change the laws so that other families will be better protected too." As the evening wound down and David prepared to drive home, Camilla walked him to his car for a conversation that had been months in the making. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected, not the bitter antagonism that often characterized divorced couples, but a genuine partnership focused on their children's well-being. "I need to thank you for testifying at the trial," Camilla said as they stood in the driveway under the streetlights. "I know it wasn't easy to admit how Rebecca had manipulated you." David leaned against his car, looking back at the house where his sons were probably trying to convince their grandmother to let them stay up past bedtime. "I should have seen what she was doing earlier. I should have protected the boys from her influence." We all missed the signs at first. Rebecca was very good at presenting herself as the concerned stepmother while hiding her real agenda. The important thing is that you chose your children over your marriage when you finally understood what was happening. "I just hope the boys can forgive me for bringing her into their lives in the first place." Camilla smiled, remembering her son's easy acceptance of their father's return to their daily routine. Kids are more forgiving than adults usually are. They're just happy to have their dad back without all the drama and conflict. As David drove away, Camilla stood in her front yard for a few minutes, looking across the street at the Santos family's house. The porch light was on, and she could see Jake and Maria cleaning up after their own family dinner. Their twin boys were playing in the living room, their laughter audible through the open windows. This was what normal looked like: neighbors who were simply neighbors, families living their lives without surveillance or suspicion, children playing without fear that their innocent activities would be misinterpreted and weaponized against their parents. Inside, Eleanor was reading bedtime stories to Marcus and Leo, her authoritative Supreme Court voice transformed into the gentle tones of a grandmother sharing adventures about brave knights and clever princesses. The boys were getting too old for bedtime stories, but they still enjoyed the tradition when their grandmother visited. "Mom, do you think Rebecca will ever get out of prison?" Marcus asked as Eleanor closed the book. "She'll be in prison for a very long time," Eleanor replied, honestly. "And when she does get out, she'll be an old woman who won't be able to hurt families anymore." "Good," Leo said with satisfaction. "She was really mean to pretend we were getting hurt when we weren't." As Eleanor turned off the bedroom light, she reflected on the simple wisdom of children who could distill complex criminal behavior down to its essential truth. Rebecca had been mean, and now she couldn't be mean to anyone anymore. Later that evening, as Camilla and Eleanor sat on the back deck with cups of tea, they talked about the lasting impact of the case beyond their own family's experience. The legislation that came out of your testimony is going to save thousands of families from going through what you endured, Eleanor said. Sometimes it takes a high-profile case to expose systemic vulnerabilities that have been hurting people for years. I just hope the reforms actually get implemented properly, Camilla replied. Laws are only as good as the people who enforce them. That's true, but the increased awareness alone will make a difference. Social workers and family court judges now know to look for patterns that might indicate coordinated false reporting, and families like yours won't be as isolated when they're targeted because there are support networks and legal resources available now. As they prepared for bed, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond her professional accomplishments on the Supreme Court. She'd used her legal expertise to protect her family and, in the process, had helped create changes that would protect other families for generations to come. The next morning brought news that provided a fitting conclusion to their ordeal. Agent Kim called to inform them that the FBI had arrested the final member of Rebecca's network, a woman in Oregon who had been coordinating false reporting campaigns against military families. Her arrest had been possible because of the digital forensics techniques developed during the Rebecca Thornton investigation. This closes out the last known cell of the conspiracy, Agent Kim explained. We estimate that your case led to the prevention of false allegations against at least 200 additional families who were being targeted by these networks. As Camilla hung up the phone, she realized that their nightmare had ultimately become other families' salvation. The pain and fear they'd endured had exposed a criminal enterprise that might have continued operating for years if Eleanor hadn't had the legal knowledge and connections to fight back effectively. That afternoon, as Eleanor prepared to return to Washington, she stood in the front yard with Marcus and Leo, watching them demonstrate their latest skateboard tricks. The ordinariness of the moment, two boys showing off for their grandmother while their mother finished packing lunches for the school week, represented a victory that couldn't be measured in legal precedents or criminal convictions. Promise me you'll call if anything like this ever happens again, Eleanor said to Camilla as they loaded her suitcase into the rental car. It won't happen again, Camilla replied with confidence. The system has too many safeguards now, and people know what to look for. Besides, I'm not the same person I was when this started. I know how to fight back now. As Eleanor's car disappeared around the corner, Camilla felt a sense of closure that had been building for months. The crisis that had threatened to destroy her family had ultimately made them stronger, brought meaningful reform to the family court system, and created a support network for other families facing similar challenges. Rebecca Thornton had intended to tear apart a loving family to satisfy her own psychological needs, but her actions had instead created a legacy of protection and justice that would benefit families across the country for years to come. Sometimes, Camilla reflected, the best victory over evil is not just surviving it, but transforming it into something that serves good. That evening, as she tucked Marcus and Leo into bed and listened to their excited chatter about upcoming school projects and weekend plans, Camilla knew that they had not just survived Rebecca's assault on their family, they had turned it into triumph. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.